Okay, well, the federal government is bringing in new measures it hopes will make amateur sports safer. Of course, the Minister of Sport is Pascale St-Onge. Earlier today, she announced some key changes that she says will help to improve governance at sport organizations, in particular saying that there will be financial consequences as well to try and achieve compliance. Here's more of what she had to say.
This compliance unit will work with experts to define the right markers and indicators to be able to monitor NSOs from now on. The performance of NSOs in areas such as governance, transparency, and accountability will be tracked through the development of action plans with each NSO. Failing to achieve improvements or meeting the requirements will have repercussions, such as financial consequences for federally funded organizations.
So will any of these measures actually help to make sports and athletes in this country any safer? For her take on that, I want to bring in former elite gymnast, Amelia Cline. She is also the co-founder of Gymnasts for Change Canada. She joins us now from Vancouver. So Amelia, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Just want to start by getting your reaction here. Do some of these proposed reforms, some of what we've heard today from Pascale St-Onge, what do you make of this?
In my view, they're band-aid solutions at best. We have been calling for over a year for a national inquiry. And the reason that we're calling for that is that we know that there is a crisis in the sports system, but we don't know precisely how and why that's happening. And so to come up with solutions before we've actually studied the problem is to put the cart before the horse. And so throwing more money at systems that we already know are broken, in my view, just is not going to be effective.
Okay, so while we wait for any sort of word here on whether or not there might be a public inquiry at some point, because certainly that is something that the Minister of Sport has resisted so far. Today, there were hints that maybe that's something that they're considering. But if we talk about some of these measures that have now been proposed, that were introduced, things such as creating a public registry for people who have been sanctioned within sports so that people, of course, could look up people's names as just one example, making sure that NDAs or non-disclosure agreements, that those aren't used to try and silence athletes. When you're talking about some of these individual proposals, is there anything in particular that stands out to you as perhaps a good idea or things that don't go far enough?
Well, I think to speak to the National Registry specifically, of course, I think that is a very good idea. We certainly need a system in place that allows parents in particular, but anyone who's engaging in sport to be able to make informed decisions about where they're sending their children to play sports. And if there is a coach who has been disciplined, what that discipline history is. However, I think the strength of a registry is only as good as the underlying mechanism to actually sanction coaches. And that is a concern that we have, that this is embedded within the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner, which is not equipped at this point to adequately handle complaints of abuse. And of course, this is all based on assuming that abuse is going to continue. There's very little in the announcements today that deal with prevention, that deal with actually getting to the underlying culture of sport to actually fix the crisis of abuse itself.
Certainly in recent months, we've heard a lot from survivors about their experience, about what it was like for them in various sports. This isn't even just focusing on one particular sport. It's really sort of been across the board here. And yet no survivor groups were consulted with some of these proposed changes. What do you make of that?
That's right. I think it's really disheartening. There are very clear, very well-organized groups now that are representing thousands of survivors in this sport system. And the fact that none of them were consulted ahead of these announcements is really troubling. I think we're seeing the same people who are at the table who have been part of the sport system for decades, who likely have contributed to the crisis that we're now in. Those are the voices that are actually having influence right now. And those who are representing survivors, who are perhaps upsetting the apple cart to some degree, are not being consulted, and that's a problem.
We are going to hear today, Amelia, from Canada Soccer's current president, Charmaine Crooks. Anything in particular you're going to be watching for or listening for?
I think generally all survivors look to these hearings and hope to see some level of accountability. We know that simply changing leadership within these sport organizations doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be a change in culture. And so I think we're looking for hard-hitting questions that are going to ask about past behavior, past complicity in maltreatment, in covering up abuse, as well as any sort of future plans to substantively change how the organization has run. Because it's really only with an overhaul that we're going to see any meaningful change and any sort of meaningful prevention for abuse to continue.
Just finally here, Amelia, how, and you and I have spoken about this before, your calls, your feeling that a national inquiry is really what is going to be needed here. How confident or optimistic are you that something like that might happen?
Well, I think we're seeing that the survivor voice has power, that we've made this a national issue that the sport minister can't ignore. And we're certainly not stopping in our call for a national inquiry. I was happy to see that the announcement today didn't kibosh a national inquiry. So it's certainly something that's still on the table and something that, quite frankly, we're expecting to see announced. And if it's not, then we really have to question the seriousness of this government to tackle this abuse crisis.
Okay, Amelia, for today, we are going to leave it there. I'm sure we will speak again, though. As always, thank you for your time and your thoughts and perspective on this.
Thank you so much.
Amelia Cline is a former elite gymnast and is also the co-founder of Gymnasts for Change Canada.